March 4th, 1944. 06:47 hours. RAF Debden, Essex, England. The metal was cold enough to burn. Captain Don Gentile pressed his gloved hand against the aluminum skin of the P-51B Mustang and felt the pre-dawn chill radiate through the leather. Around him, the airfield was a symphony of controlled chaos. Ground crews swarming over fighters, fuel trucks rumbling between hard stands, the sharp smell of high-octane gasoline cutting through the damp English air. Above, the sky was still dark, stars fading into the gray promise of morning. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. Gentile walked slowly around his aircraft, conducting the ritual inspection that every pilot performed before every mission, though by now, his hands knew the routine better than his conscious mind. Tires, inflated, no visible. Damage, control surfaces, free movement, no binding. Propeller blades, no nicks, no cracks. And there, slung beneath each wing like pregnant teardrops, the two external fuel tanks that would define this mission and, though he could not know it yet, the future of the air war over Europe. Each drop tank held 75 gallons of fuel, 150 gallons total, added to the Mustang's internal capacity of 269 gallons. 419 gallons. Enough, the mission planners said, to escort the bomber stream all the way to Berlin and back. All the way. The phrase had been repeated in the briefing room an hour earlier, with a kind of reverent disbelief, as if saying it aloud might break whatever spell made it possible. Berlin, the capital of the Reich, the heart of Hitler's empire, 600 miles from the English coast, deeper into Germany than any Allied fighter had ever penetrated, with enough fuel to fight in return. For 2 years, that distance had been a mathematical impossibility, a gap in the sky where American bombers flew alone and died in appalling numbers. The Luftwaffe commanders had planned their defensive strategy around it, positioned their fighter bases to exploit it, grown confident in the certainty that geography and fuel capacity were allies as reliable as armor and ammunition. But today, beneath Gentile's Mustang and beneath 300 other Mustangs warming up across a dozen English airfields, hung the answer to an equation the Germans had believed unsolvable: 75 gallons per wing. Pressed aluminum, riveted and sealed, designed to be jettisoned when empty or when combat required maneuverability. Cheap, disposable. Unremarkable in every way except one. They worked. Gentile climbed into the cockpit as the eastern horizon began to bleed pink and gold. The Merlin engine coughed, caught, and settled into a smooth, powerful idle that vibrated through the airframe. He checked his instruments with practiced efficiency. Oil, pressure, fuel pressure, manifold pressure, all green. The radio crackled with the voices of other pilots checking in, confirming readiness, exchanging the laconic banter that masked tension. At 07:15, the first Mustangs began to roll. By 07:30, they were airborne, climbing into the dawn, each one trailing a faint mist of condensation from its wingtips. And slung beneath each wing, those two simple aluminum containers that would carry them farther than any fighter had gone before. The Germans were waiting, but they were not expecting this. To understand the mockery, one must first understand the desperation that preceded it. In 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had committed itself to a doctrine that bordered on the suicidal, daylight strategic bombing of Germany. The theory was elegant. American bombers, flying in massed formations at high altitude in broad daylight, would destroy Germany's industrial capacity with precision bombing, while their own defensive armament, up to 1350 caliber machine guns per B-17, would fend off fighter attacks. The British, who had abandoned daylight bombing after catastrophic losses in 1940, considered the American plan a fantasy born of inexperience and arrogance. They were not entirely wrong. The early deep penetration raids into Germany revealed a brutal reality. So bombers, no matter how heavily armed or tightly grouped, could not survive determined fighter attacks without escort. On August 17, 1943, a raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg lost 60 bombers out of 376 dispatched, a 16% loss rate in a single day. On October 14, 1943, a second Schweinfurt raid lost another 60 B-17s out of 291, with 17 more so badly damaged they never flew again. 26% losses, unsustainable, catastrophic. The problem was range. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the 8th Air Force's primary escort fighter in 1943, could reach the German border, with external drop tanks but no farther. The P-38 Lightning had better range but suffered chronic engine problems at high altitude and lacked the performance to match German fighters in a turning fight. The Spitfire, magnificent in a dogfight over England, had the endurance of a sprinter asked to run a marathon. What was needed, what desperate bomber crews prayed for, and planners sketched on maps and engineers calculated in wind tunnels, was a fighter that could escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. A fighter with the range of a light bomber, but the performance of an interceptor. A fighter that could fight at Berlin and then fight its way home. In late 1943, such a fighter did not exist. Or rather, it existed on drawing boards and in the cautious optimism of test pilots, but not yet in the operational reality of combat squadrons. The Germans, monitoring Allied fighter development through intelligence reports and examination of captured aircraft, saw the specifications and dismissed them. The laws of physics were well understood. Range required fuel. Fuel added weight. Weight degraded performance. A fighter with bomber-like range would fly like a bomber, slow, sluggish, vulnerable. The Germans had done the mathematics. They had run the calculations. They were certain. And then, in December 1943, the first P-51B Mustangs with British-built Packard Merlin engines and American-designed external drop tanks began arriving at 8th Air Force bases in England. The Mustang's development was a testament to the chaotic improvisation that characterized wartime engineering. The aircraft had been designed in 1940 by North American Aviation in response to a British Purchasing Commission's request for a fighter to supplement the RAF's Spitfire production. The original design, powered by an American Allison engine, was fast at low altitude but anemic above 15,000 feet, adequate for ground attack or tactical reconnaissance, inadequate for high-altitude bomber escort. Then, almost by accident, someone had the idea of mating the Mustang's sleek airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the Spitfire. The result was transformative. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger gave the Mustang blistering performance at high altitude, 440 mph at 25,000 feet, comparable to or better than any German fighter. Its laminar flow wing design, a product of American aerodynamic research, reduced drag and increased efficiency, and its internal fuel capacity, significantly greater than other fighters, gave it endurance that seemed almost impossible. But even the Mustang's internal fuel, 269 gallons, was insufficient for the Berlin mission. The solution was conceptually simple but technically demanding: external drop tanks. The idea of auxiliary fuel tanks was not new. The Luftwaffe had used them since the Battle of Britain, and the P-47 had been fitted with them in 1943. But the Mustang's drop tanks were different in a crucial way. They were mass-produced, standardized, and, most importantly, aerodynamically refined, enough not to destroy the aircraft's performance while attached. Early drop tank designs had been aerodynamic disasters, draggy and prone to buffeting that made the aircraft nearly unflyable. The Mustang's drop tanks, designed through iterative testing and manufactured by the hundreds of thousands in American factories, were teardrop-shaped to minimize drag. They attached to hard points beneath the wings with quick-release mechanisms that allowed pilots to jettison them instantly when combat began, or when fuel was exhausted. They were, in every sense, consumable, used once and discarded, like ammunition casings or packing crates. The Germans, accustomed to operating under conditions of chronic scarcity, found this profligacy difficult to comprehend. Luftwaffe pilots flew with reusable auxiliary tanks that had to be returned, refilled, and reused. The idea of manufacturing thousands of aluminum containers, using them once, and then abandoning them over occupied Europe seemed wasteful to the point of absurdity. It was, to their way of thinking, typical American excess, using resources as if they were infinite, solving problems by throwing material at them rather than through elegant engineering. They were right about the excess. they were wrong about the effectiveness. In the Luftwaffe's operational headquarters scattered across Germany and occupied France, the intelligence reports arriving in early 1944 were noted with a mixture of interest and skepticism. American fighters had been observed carrying large external tanks. Range appeared to be increasing, but the fundamental limitations remained, surely. A fighter burdened with drop tanks would be slow and unmaneuverable. German fighters could attack, force the Americans to jettison their tanks, and then exploit their numerical advantage in fuel to either continue the fight or disengage, at will. Major Hans Waldmann, a veteran fighter pilot with 32 confirmed kills, expressed the prevailing attitude in a letter to his wife, dated February 12, 1944. The Americans are trying a new trick with their fighters, carrying extra fuel and tanks beneath the wings. It may extend their range somewhat, but a fighter is not a transport plane. We will see how well their long-range escorts perform when they must choose between their fuel and their lives. I suspect they will choose to drop the tanks and return home as they always have. Waldmann's assessment was logical. It was based on experience and sound tactical reasoning. It was shared by nearly every German pilot and commander who reviewed the intelligence. And it would be proven catastrophically wrong within 3 weeks. The flaw in their reasoning was twofold. First, they underestimated the Mustang's performance even when carrying drop tanks. The aircraft's clean design meant that the additional drag, while significant, did not reduce speed and maneuverability to the extent German calculations predicted. A Mustang with full drop tanks was still faster than most German fighters at high altitude. Second, and more fundamentally, they failed to grasp the American approach to the escort mission. American fighter pilots were not being sent to Germany to conserve fuel and return safely. They were being sent to destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. The drop tanks gave them the range to reach Berlin, but the Merlin engine and the Mustang's airframe gave them the performance to dominate the fight when they got there. The tanks were not a limitation to be endured. They were the key that unlocked the entire theater of operations. On the morning of March 4, 1944, as Don Gentile and 300 other Mustang pilots climbed toward the bomber stream assembling over England, this distinction was about to become lethally clear. The bomber stream, when the fighters reached it, was a sight that defied easy description. More than 500 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, stacked in combat boxes at altitudes between 22 and 26,000 feet, stretching across 30 miles of sky. Each bomber was a small city unto itself. 10 men, 13 guns, 4 tons of bombs, 4,000 horsepower, straining to maintain altitude and formation. Together, they represented the industrial might of a nation that could build heavy bombers faster than the enemy could destroy them, crew them with men barely out of adolescence, and send them back day after day regardless of losses. The bomber crews, watching the Mustangs slide into escort positions on their flanks, felt something they had not felt in months: hope. For too long, they had flown the final leg into Germany alone, watching their escort fighters peel away as fuel gauges dropped toward critical levels, knowing that beyond a certain point, the point marked on maps as maximum escort, penetration, they would face the Luftwaffe alone. Men had calculated their survival odds based on where their target fell relative to that invisible line in the sky. Targets beyond the line, Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, were death sentences handed down by the law of fuel capacity. But today, the Mustangs were not turning back. Today, they were still there at the German border, throttled back to match the bombers' slower speed, drop tanks still attached. The bomber crews watched and allowed themselves to believe. At 09:45 hours over the Netherlands, the first German fighters appeared. They came from above and ahead, 2 groups of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, totaling perhaps 40 aircraft, diving toward the bomber formation with the disciplined aggression of veterans who had flown this profile hundreds of times. The standard Luftwaffe tactic, a high-speed slashing attack from the front, targeting the lead bombers, firing and diving away before the defensive gunners could track them. Then a rapid climb back to altitude to reset for another pass, while the American escorts, low on fuel, would be forced to withdraw. Except the American escorts were not withdrawing. Don Gentile saw the German formation before the radio call confirmed it. sunlight glinting off canopies at 2 o'clock high. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, mixture rich, propeller full increase, gun sight on. Around him, the Mustang formation was already reacting, splitting into elements, climbing to meet the threat. And then, with a simple flip of 2 switches, Gentile jettisoned his drop tanks. They tumbled away, silver cylinders spinning toward the Dutch countryside below, their purpose fulfilled. The Mustang, suddenly 600 pounds lighter, leaped forward as if unleashed. Gentile hauled back on the stick, the Merlin engine howling, and the aircraft climbed with a ferocity that still surprised him even after months of flying it. Within seconds, he was at the German fighter's altitude. Within 15 seconds, he had a firing solution on a Focke-Wulf that had not seen him coming. The battle lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, 11 German fighters were falling from the sky, trailing smoke and flame. The bomber formation continued eastward, untouched, and the Mustangs, fuel gauges reading 3/4 full despite the combat and the distance already flown, remained in position. Over the radio, a German controller's voice, monitored by Allied listening stations and recorded for later analysis. Achtung, die amerikanischen Jäger kommen nicht zurück. Sie bleiben bei den Bombern. Attention, the American fighters are not turning back. They are staying with the bombers. There was something in that transmission, a note of surprise, perhaps the first edge of concern, that spoke to a realization dawning in real time. The rules had changed. The mathematics that had governed the air war for 2 years no longer held. The safe distance, the protected depth, the guaranteed sanctuary beyond the reach of escort fighters, all of it was gone, dissolved by 75-gallon aluminum tanks and the industrial capacity to produce them by the thousands. The Mustangs pressed on toward Berlin. The city appeared on the horizon shortly after noon, visible first as a dark smudge against the winter landscape, then resolving into the unmistakable geometry of a major urban center, rail lines converging like spokes, the Brandenburg Plain spreading flat and brown around it, the frozen Spree River cutting through the heart of the Reich's capital. For the bomber crews, it was a target like any other, marked on maps with concentric circles indicating flak concentration and assigned aiming points. For the German civilians sheltering in basements and bunkers below, it was the sound of air raid sirens that had become as routine as factory whistles, a daily reminder that the war's consequences had come home. But for the Luftwaffe fighter, pilots scrambling from airfields around Berlin, it was something else entirely: disbelief. American 4-engine bombers over Berlin were not new. The 8th Air Force had staged raids on the capital before, most notably on March 3rd, just 1 day earlier. But those raids had been flown without escort for the final leg, the fighters turning back west of the city, the bombers continuing alone. The Luftwaffe had inflicted painful losses. 69 bombers shot down in 2 days of raids. It had been brutal but sustainable from the German perspective, a continuation of the attrition warfare that they believed, correctly, the Allies could not maintain indefinitely. But now, over Berlin itself, there were American fighters. Mustangs circling above the bomber formation, Mustangs engaging the interceptors rising from the airfields below, Mustangs still carrying enough fuel to fight rather than merely survive. The impossible had become routine. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, a decorated pilot, with 28 kills who would survive the war and later emigrate to Canada, described the moment in a post-war interview. "We climbed up to engage the bombers as we always had, expecting to have perhaps 10 minutes before the American escorts ran low on fuel and had to leave. But they did not leave. We fought them over Berlin, over our own capital, and they were not worried about fuel. They were aggressive, confident. It was then I knew, I think many of us knew, that something fundamental had changed. If they could come to Berlin and fight over Berlin, then nowhere was safe. Every airfield, every factory, every city was now within their reach. The distance that had protected us was gone." The battle over Berlin on March 4th, 1944, was not the largest aerial engagement of the war, nor the most decisive in terms of casualties inflicted, but it was the most symbolically significant. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was forced to defend its capital against not just bombers, but a fully integrated strike package, bombers with fighter escort, from takeoff to target to return. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was profound. The doctrine that had sustained them, The belief that geography and fuel capacity would always limit Allied fighters and create opportunities for interception was revealed as obsolete. Don Gentile shot down 2 Messerschmitt Bf 109s over Berlin that day, bringing his total to 17 confirmed kills. In his after-action report, written in the cramped, exhausted shorthand of a pilot who had flown 7 hours and fought 2 engagements, he noted, "Drop tanks allowed penetration to target area with sufficient fuel reserve for combat and return. No concerns about fuel state during engagement. Recommend continued use." That laconic recommendation, buried in a stack of mission reports, captured the revolution in 4 sentences. The drop tank, cheap, disposable, unglamorous, had solved the unsolvable problem. It had turned the P-51 from an excellent fighter into a strategic weapon. It had made Berlin reachable, and in doing so, it had broken the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy. The German response to the new reality was rapid and increasingly desperate. Within a week of the first Berlin escort mission, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine was revised. Fighter units were ordered to engage American escorts before they could reach the bombers, trading their altitude advantage for the chance to force combat, while the Mustangs still carried drop tanks. The theory was sound: catch the escorts early, force them to jettison tanks to fight, reduce their fuel reserves, create the old dynamic where German fighters could dictate the terms of engagement. In practice, it rarely worked. The Mustangs, even with drop tanks attached, were fast enough to choose whether to engage or to remain with the bombers. And once the tanks were jettisoned, which took seconds, the performance advantage swung decisively to the Americans. The Merlin-powered Mustang was faster than the Bf-109G at all altitudes above 20,000 feet, and could turn with the Focke-Wulf 190 while maintaining energy better. Moreover, the American pilots were increasingly experienced and aggressive, freed from the previous constraints that had forced conservative fuel management. The second German response was to increase the number of fighters committed to each interception, attempting to overwhelm the escorts through sheer numbers. This succeeded in creating larger, more chaotic battles, but did nothing to stop the bombers. For every escort fighter tied up in a dogfight, there were 3 more maintaining position with the bomber stream. And the arithmetic of attrition, which had once favored the Luftwaffe operating on short interior lines with nearby bases, now favored the Americans, who could replace lost aircraft, and pilots faster than Germany could train new ones. The third response was never officially acknowledged, but was evident in the statistics: avoidance. Luftwaffe fighters increasingly declined combat when the odds were unfavorable, preserving strength for missions where conditions offered tactical advantage. It was rational, it was necessary given the resource constraints, and it meant that bomber formations with strong escort often reached their targets and returned without encountering significant opposition. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force flew over 20,000 bomber sorties and lost 185 bombers to all causes, less than 1%. In October 1943, the loss rate had been above 5%. The difference was the Mustang and its drop tanks. By April, the mass-produced aluminum containers had become so ubiquitous that ground crews stacked them beside runways like cordwood, loading them onto Mustangs with the casual efficiency of workers handling any other consumable supply. Each tank cost approximately $60 to manufacture, less than a single artillery shell from a battleship's main. Gun, less than 1/10 the cost of a fighter's landing gear. Tens of thousands were produced. Many were used multiple times before battle damage or wear made them unreliable. Many more were jettisoned over Europe, falling into fields and forests where they would be found decades later by farmers and hikers, physical artifacts of a strategic revolution. The Germans, who had mocked the long-range escort concept, stopped mocking. Instead, they began manufacturing their own drop tanks in greater numbers, trying to extend the range of their fighters to meet the new threat. But it was a reactive measure, an attempt to match an advantage rather than to counter it. The strategic initiative had passed. The Americans could decide when and where to fight. The Luftwaffe could only respond. There is a peculiar intimacy to the artifacts of war, a quality that transcends their utilitarian function and becomes something symbolic. The drop tank, in this sense, was more than a fuel container. It became a physical manifestation of American industrial power, of the nation's ability to produce not just enough, but far more than enough. 75 gallons of fuel carried in a disposable aluminum shell, used once and discarded, replaced the next day by another from the endless production lines of American factories. To the bomber crews watching their escorts remain in position all the way to Berlin and back, the drop tank represented survival. It was the reason the fighters did not turn back, the reason the Luftwaffe faced opposition at every point in the mission profile, the reason more men came home. To them, the simple teardrop shape slung beneath a Mustang's wing was as significant as the bombs in their own bays. It was the tool that made their mission survivable. To the Luftwaffe pilots who faced the Mustangs over Germany's cities and factories, the drop tank represented the material superiority they could not match. Germany was fighting a war on multiple fronts with shrinking resources, bomb-damaged factories, and a logistics system under constant air attack. The idea of manufacturing fuel tanks by the tens of thousands only to use them once and discard them was incomprehensible. It spoke to a depth of industrial capacity that was, from the German perspective, almost grotesque in its abundance. And to the Americans who conceived, designed, and produced the drop tanks, the engineers at North American Aviation, the workers in war production plants, the logistics officers who shipped them across the Atlantic, they represented something simpler: problem solving. The bombers needed escort. The fighters needed range. Range required fuel. Therefore, add fuel capacity. The solution was not elegant. It was not efficient by peacetime standards, but it worked, and in total war, efficacy was the only virtue that mattered. This pragmatic approach to warfare, the willingness to solve problems through material abundance rather than through optimization, within scarcity, was a distinctly American characteristic. It manifested in countless ways throughout the war. The Liberty ship program that produced cargo vessels faster than submarines could sink them. The M4 Sherman tank that was inferior in armor and firepower to German tanks, but produced in such numbers that numerical advantage became overwhelming. The 50 caliber machine gun that equipped everything from fighters to jeeps to fortifications. The drop tank fit this pattern perfectly. It was not a revolutionary technology. The concept was decades old. The Germans had used drop tanks. The Japanese had used drop tanks. But only the Americans produced them at a scale that fundamentally altered strategic possibilities. Only American industry could afford to treat a complex aluminum structure as a disposable commodity, and only American logistics could deliver them in sufficient quantities to every airfield that needed them, every day without fail. By war's end, over 500,000. Drop tanks would be manufactured for American fighters. More than half would be jettisoned over enemy territory, abandoned after use, their metal scavenged by civilians for repair of farm equipment or construction of shelters. They were, in a very literal sense, wealth scattered across Europe. American aluminum, American manufacturing capacity, American excess made physical and then discarded. The Germans collected them when they could, studied them, measured them, tried to learn from them. But the lesson encoded in the drop tank was not one that could be replicated through reverse engineering. The lesson was about systems, about an economy that could produce unlimited quantities of consumable goods, about a logistics network that could distribute them globally, about a strategic vision that understood material abundance as a weapon as potent as any battleship or bomber. You cannot copy a system. You can only build your own. And by 1944, Germany's system was fracturing under the weight of Allied bombardment and multi-front warfare, while America's system was reaching peak efficiency, producing more of everything than could be immediately used. The final months of the air war over Europe followed a trajectory made inevitable by the Mustang's extended range. With Berlin now routinely reachable, no target in Germany was beyond escort protection. The 8th and 15th Air Forces, operating from England and Italy respectively, could strike any city, any factory, any transportation hub, with the confidence that fighter escort would be present from takeoff to landing. The Luftwaffe, forced to defend everywhere, could concentrate nowhere. Its pilots, many of them new replacements with minimal training, faced experienced American fighter pilots in aircraft that were, at minimum, equal in performance and often superior. The loss rates told the story in stark numerical terms. In the first quarter of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 fighter pilots killed or yet missing. In the second quarter, the number exceeded 1,500. These were not merely statistics. They were the destruction of institutional knowledge, the erosion of the veteran cadre that had sustained German fighter aviation since 1939. New pilots were shot down on their first or second missions, sometimes without ever firing their guns. The Americans called it a turkey shoot, a phrase that captured both the one-sided nature of the engagements and the casual confidence that came from total tactical superiority. Don Gentile would finish the war with 21.83 confirmed aerial victories, the fractional credits reflecting shared kills, and would be shot down once, bailing out over France and returning to England through the escape network. He would survive the war, return to America a celebrated ace, and die in 1951 in a training accident, flying a T-33 jet trainer. At his funeral, fellow pilots spoke of his aggression in combat, his skill as a fighter pilot, and his role in the victory over Germany. None of them mentioned the drop tank specifically, because by then they were a footnote, a mundane technical detail, overshadowed by the dramatic narratives of aerial combat. But the drop tanks had made those combats possible. They had made Gentile's victories possible. They had made the bomber offensive sustainable and ultimately successful. They were the unglamorous foundation upon which a strategic revolution was built. In the decades after the war, military historians and aviation enthusiasts would debate the factors that led to Allied air superiority over Europe. The list was long: superior aircraft production, the two-front war that stretched German resources, the disruption of German fuel supplies, the training advantages that gave American pilots more flight hours before combat, the tactical innovations in Escort doctrine. All of these were valid. All contributed to the outcome. But at the center of that web of factors was a simple aluminum container, 75 gallons capacity, designed to be used once and discarded. The drop tank did not win the air war by itself. No single technology ever does. But it was the enabling element, the piece that made everything else work. Without it, the Mustang was just another excellent fighter with insufficient range. With it, the Mustang became the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back. There is a museum in Duxford, England, on the site of a former RAF fighter base, where a restored P-51D Mustang sits in a climate-controlled hangar, its aluminum skin polished to mirror brightness. Beneath each wing hangs a reproduction drop tank, accurate in every detail, except that these tanks are permanent installations, secured with bolts rather than quick-release mechanisms. They will never be jettisoned. They will never fall from 25,000 feet to tumble across European farmland. They are museum pieces, representations of history. But on the museum's information placard, there is a paragraph that reads, "The addition of external drop tanks gave the P-51 Mustang the range to escort bombers to any target in Germany. This capability, more than any single technological or tactical innovation, ensured Allied air superiority and the success of the strategic bombing campaign." 29 words summarizing a revolution. 29 words explaining how mockery turned to fear, how mathematical certainty was overturned by industrial capacity, how the unreachable became routine. The Germans had been certain that long-range escort was impossible. They had done the calculations. They had built their defenses around that certainty. And then, over Berlin on a March morning in 1944, they watched American fighters circle above American bombers and understood that certainty in war is a luxury afforded only to those with resources to enforce it. America had the resources. America had the factories. America had the engineers who could look at a tactical problem and solve it. Not with elegance or efficiency, but with abundance, with 75-gallon aluminum containers produced by the hundreds of thousands and used without hesitation or regret. And in the end, that abundance was the answer to every German advantage in training, experience, and defensive positioning. You could be the better pilot flying the better aircraft with the superior tactics, but if you ran out of fuel before the fight was finished, none of it mattered. The American fighters did not run out of fuel. They carried extra. They carried enough. They carried more than enough. That was the promise encoded in the drop tank. The promise that no target was too distant, no mission too ambitious, no defense too deep. The promise that American bombers would not fly alone. The promise that the Luftwaffe would face opposition not just at the border, but at the target. Not just over occupied territory, but over the Reich itself. Not just sometimes, but every single time. It was a promise kept with aluminum and rivets and $60 worth of manufacturing cost, repeated 500,000 times, scattered across a continent, discarded without ceremony or sentiment. It was abundance weaponized. It was industrial might, translated into tactical reality. It was the unglamorous, practical, overwhelmingly effective American approach to warfare. Identify the problem, build the solution, produce it in massive quantities, and deploy it until the problem ceases to exist. The Germans mocked the long-range Escort because they could not imagine it. Their imagination was constrained by their resources, their experience shaped by scarcity. They fought brilliantly with what they had, optimized every advantage, and believed that optimization would be sufficient. But the Americans did not fight with what they had. They fought with what they could produce. And what they could produce was, quite literally, more than enough to reach Berlin. The drop tanks fell like aluminum rain across Europe, each one a small monument to industrial excess and strategic vision. They were not celebrated. They were not named or commemorated or enshrined in poetry. They were simply used, discarded, and replaced. And they won the war. Not alone, never alone, but necessarily, inevitably. With the quiet certainty of mathematics rewritten by those who could afford to carry extra fuel and the will to use it. They mocked the long-range Escort, until 75-gallon aluminum containers rendered their mockery obsolete, and the Mustangs pushed the bombers all the way to Berlin, and the sky above the Reich's capital filled with American fighters that could not be turned back. And after that, there was no more mockery, only the sound of Merlin engines over Berlin and the knowledge that distance, which once was safety, had become just another problem solved by American abundance and American will. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.